The mess hall buzzed with conversation and the clatter of trays, but Emily Walker barely heard any of it. She sat alone near the end of a long metal table, pushing pieces of overcooked chicken around her plate, pretending not to hear the laughter coming from the group a few seats down. It always started the same way. Someone made a comment about marksmanship scores. Someone else mentioned her name a little too loudly, and the rest joined in like it was a sport. Corporal James leaned back in his chair loud enough for everyone within 20 feet to hear him. He talked about the Desert Eagle, how it kicked like a mule, how real shooters loved a challenge, and then let his gaze settle on her. Said something about how Emily probably couldn't even hit the wall with it from 10 feet away, might as well be blindfolded. The table roared with laughter, and she felt her ears go hot as she stared down at the scratches in the table. She tried to ignore it like always, tried to breathe through it like they taught in those resilience workshops. But then James stood up, cocky grin in full-force voice rising above the noise. Said if she was so sure of herself, maybe she should prove it. Try the Desert Eagle. Said they'd all love to see that. The mess hall fell quiet like someone had flipped a switch. Emily looked up. Her chest was tight and her palms damp, but she stood anyway. She met his eyes steady now and said she would. When she was done, he'd be the first to admit he was wrong. The room didn't quite know what to do with that, and she could feel the energy shift. Uncertainty replacing ridicule, curiosity flickering in the silence. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to make her believe this time would be different. Emily Walker grew up in the kind of Wyoming town where everyone knew your middle name and what you ate for breakfast. It was quiet, surrounded by dusty roads and endless stretches of pine, and it moved at the pace of cattle drives and small-town gossip. She spent most of her childhood trailing behind her father, who spoke little and expected much. He taught her to shoot before she was tall enough to hold a rifle steady. Saturdays weren't for cartoons or sleep-ins, they were for target practice behind the barn. Every missed shot was met with silence or a sharp glance, and the only praise she ever remembered was the absence of correction. Her father wasn't cruel, but he believed in utility over affection. In his world, people proved their worth through competence. If you couldn't shoot, you were a liability. If you hesitated, you didn't belong. Emily learned early to measure herself in failures and near misses. She wasn't bad with a rifle, but she wasn't good either. And for a man like her father, good wasn't optional. She'd hear him on the phone sometimes talking about how her younger brother had a natural eye, how he might go pro if he wanted. Emily would sit outside the door, rifle oil still on her fingers, and stare at the floor. School wasn't much better. She was shy, the kind of girl teachers forgot to call on and classmates overlooked. She kept her head down, wrote in her journals, and tried not to make mistakes. Her world was small and quiet, and it stayed that way for years. She didn't join the military to prove anything to anyone else. She joined because she didn't know who she was outside of what she wasn't. She thought maybe if she pushed herself into something bigger, harder, louder, she might finally drown out the voice that said she'd never be enough. Basic training hit her like a flood. The shouting, the structure, the eyes watching her every move. She kept up, but barely. When she qualified in marksmanship, it was just above the minimum. She pretended not to notice the looks. She tried not to care that she was always last to be picked for drills. Still, she stayed. There was something about the uniform that felt grounding. Something about waking up every day with a purpose, even if that purpose was just surviving another round of morning PT. She didn't speak much, didn't laugh when others did, but she listened and she watched. And deep down, she kept hoping she'd find a way to belong. Emily carried her past like a worn backpack, heavy, but familiar. She never let go of it, but she also never let it slow her down more than it had to. Some nights she'd stare at the ceiling and imagine what it would feel like to be good at something. Not just adequate, not just tolerated, but genuinely admired. She didn't crave medals or speeches. She just wanted the silence to stop meaning shame. She wanted to walk into a room and not feel like she had to earn her right to be there. That quiet hope tucked beneath all the doubt was what kept her going. It was thin, but it held. And it was enough. The sun hadn't even cleared the trees when the first shots cracked across the range. Emily adjusted her stance, tried to slow her breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, just like the one before it, and she felt her stomach tighten as the target reeled back untouched. Behind her, someone coughed loud enough to sound like a laugh. Another muttered her name in a way that wasn't friendly. She kept her eyes on the horizon, pretending not to hear, but the burn in her chest told her it landed anyway. Corporal James didn't need to say much. He just made sure to walk by her lane when he didn't have to glance at her scorecard and smirk like it said everything. His voice was never the loudest, but it was the one that stuck. When he did speak, it was sharp enough to cut. Emily reloaded and fired again, this time clipping the very edge of the paper. The hit should have felt like progress, but it didn't. All she could think of was her father's voice from a childhood hunting trip, cold and blunt, saying, "If you can't shoot clean, you don't belong in the field." The sound of her own shots was drowned out by the rhythm of others hitting center mass with ease. Her teammates moved with practiced grace like the rifle was just another part of them. She felt clunky by comparison, her grip always just a little too tight, her breath never quite in sync. She told herself it would get better, told herself she just needed more time. But each failure stacked up until it started to feel like proof she didn't deserve to wear the same uniform. Even during breaks, the range followed her. Someone would toss out a joke at lunch, a sideways comment in the hallway. Her name became shorthand for someone falling behind, and she never quite figured out how to shut it down. The worst part was she understood them. She wanted to be better. She wanted to belong. But no matter how hard she trained, her hands still shook when she lined up the shot, and the target always seemed just a little too far. Sometimes late at night, she'd lie in her bunk and replay the day in her head. Not the drills or the orders, but the moments between. The quiet look from a squad mate. The way James had laughed when she missed again. The feeling in her gut when she walked off the range knowing everyone saw her fail. Each time she stepped back onto the firing line, she hoped something would click, that the fear would finally give way to instinct. But it never did. And with every round fired, she felt herself drifting further from the soldier she wanted to be. It started with whispers passed along in the quiet spaces between drills and meetings. Someone mentioned how Emily froze during a simulation, how she just stood there when the targets popped up like she couldn't decide what to do. The story wasn't true. Not the way they told it, but it didn't matter. Once it left James's mouth. He had a way of telling things that made people lean in. Said her rifle jammed once and she panicked, took too long to clear it. Said she dropped her weapon during a night drill and nearly compromised the whole team. No one asked for context. No one asked her. She heard parts of it while walking by open doors, caught her name in conversations that stopped when she looked up. In the mess hall, the glances became longer, some with pity, most with something colder, like she'd become a cautionary tale. Assignments changed without warning. She stopped being called for field drills. They put her on inventory logistics, whatever kept her off the line. At first she thought it was coincidence, then it became routine. Then it became punishment disguised as protocol. Even Jessica, her roommate, stopped saying much. She still offered a soft smile now and then, but the comfort was thin. Emily could feel the distance growing between her and everyone else, like a fog settling in that no one wanted to walk through. One afternoon she heard someone joke that command was moving her to admin because they didn't trust her with a loaded weapon. The laugh that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to reach her ears. She didn't look up. She just finished her tray and left. Each day chipped away at something she'd worked hard to build. Not just skill or reputation, but the fragile thread of belief she still had in herself. And every time she tried to speak up, it felt like her words would fall into a room that had already made up its mind. James didn't need to yell. He let the stories do the work. Let others connect the dots he drew. That kind of damage didn't need volume. It just needed time. And time was doing its job. Slowly, steadily, she was being erased from the soldier they thought could become something, rewritten into the one who didn't belong. The worst part wasn't the lies. It was how easy they were to believe, how little it took for people to turn their backs. She knew the truth, but the truth was heavy when you carried it alone. And Emily had never felt more alone than in those quiet stretches of days where no one looked her in the eye. She didn't know how to fight back. Not yet. But she knew one thing with painful clarity. If she didn't do something soon, they wouldn't have to push her out. She'd walk out herself, and they'd never have to remember her name. The base library was never crowded, especially in the evenings when most soldiers relaxed in the lounge or called home. Emily liked the silence. It gave her space to breathe without feeling watched. That night she sat tucked in a back corner, the smell of old pages and laminated covers settling around her like a blanket. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Something to help her feel less powerless. Something to help her understand how the best shooters did what they did. The technical shelves were thick with manuals, binders, and old field books that hadn't been touched in years. One book stood out because it was falling apart. A copy of the Ultimate Sniper pages, dog-eared and spine-cracked. She flipped through it absent-mindedly until a section stopped her cold. It talked about training in darkness, about elite shooters developing muscle memory, so sharp they could hit targets blindfolded. The idea sounded impossible. It also sounded like something no one would ever expect from her. She read the section again, then again, tracing every word with her finger. It described how training without sight forced the brain to sharpen other senses, how repetition carved certainty into instinct. She spent the next 2 hours hunched over the book, barely moving. When the library lights flickered for closing, she checked out everything related to sniper training, human perception, and combat psychology. Her arms were full as she walked back to the barracks, but her mind felt lighter than it had in weeks. The next night she returned. Then the next. Emily wasn't just reading. She was studying, memorizing diagrams, watching old training footage when she could find it. She filled her notebook with techniques, drills, and questions she didn't yet have answers to. She kept her routine quiet, went to chow early, left fast, and slipped into the library before anyone noticed. Her evenings were spent scribbling notes while others watched TV or scrolled through their phones. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like control. The more she learned, the clearer her plan became. Not just to improve, not just to pass, but to master something so rare and difficult that no one could twist it into failure. If she could shoot blindfolded with the Desert Eagle, the same weapon most people could barely handle with both eyes, open, no one could argue with that. She knew it sounded extreme, maybe even reckless, but it made sense in a way nothing else had. She couldn't out-talk the rumors. She couldn't ask for their respect, but she could make them watch. She visualized it, over and over, standing at the range, lifting the weapon, closing her eyes, pulling the trigger. The sound of silence before the gasps, the disbelief on their faces, the shift in power slow and irreversible. She wasn't chasing revenge. She was chasing dignity, the kind that didn't need to be spoken, the kind that echoed in silence and stillness, in the calm that came from knowing who you were. Her notebook filled with outlines and training milestones. She mapped out weekly goals, dry fire practice, grip repetition, mental rehearsal. She didn't know how long it would take, but that didn't matter anymore. By the time the others noticed anything, it would be too late to doubt her. Emily didn't want to be feared. She didn't want to be liked. She just wanted to be undeniable. Sitting alone in that quiet corner of the library, surrounded by books no one else cared about, she made a promise. If they insisted on seeing her as a failure, she'd give them something impossible to look away from, something they would never forget. It was late when Emily stepped out of the library, arms full of manuals and her notebook tucked under one elbow. The sky was dark, the base mostly quiet except for the distant hum of night watch. She didn't notice the figure standing near the path until she was almost beside him. Master Sergeant Ford was known across the base, but hardly anyone spoke to him unless they had a reason. He was tall, built like he'd never lost a fight, and had the kind of presence that made people straighten up even when he didn't say a word. Emily paused when she saw him, unsure whether to keep walking or say something. He nodded once, not unkindly, then looked at the books in her hands, said he'd noticed her there most nights, asked if she was preparing for something. She hesitated, unsure if he was just making conversation or calling her out. Then she told the truth, all of it. She said she wanted to learn to shoot blindfolded, said she knew it sounded strange, maybe even reckless, but that she'd read about it and believed she could do it if she worked hard enough. Said it was the only thing she could think of that might shut people up and finally give her peace. Ford didn't laugh, didn't blink, just stood quiet for a moment before asking her why it mattered so much. Emily swallowed hard, told him it wasn't about revenge. It was about proving to herself that she wasn't broken, that her worth wasn't tied to who people thought she was. He looked at her like he was measuring something deeper than her words. Then he said, if she was serious, really serious, he could help. But it wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. And no one could know. She nodded before he even finished speaking. The relief in her chest was quiet but full. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't carrying it alone. He told her to meet him at the armory the next morning at 0500, said to wear workout gear and bring a notebook, said they'd start with the basics and see if she really had what it took. Then he turned and walked into the night. Just like that. Emily stood there for a moment, letting it settle in. Someone had seen her. Not her failure, not her reputation, but the effort she kept pouring into something no one else believed in. That night she lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling. She didn't feel nervous. She felt ready. It was the first time in months that tomorrow didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to step into. The armory was cold when Emily arrived, that first morning breath catching in her throat as she stepped inside. Master Sergeant Ford was already there, standing beside a steel table lined with the parts of a desert eagle laid out like a puzzle. He handed her a pair of gloves and nodded to the table, without a word. Her fingers fumbled almost immediately. The weight of the slide, the tiny tension in the spring, the stubborn pin that refused to budge each piece reminded her how unfamiliar it all was. Ford didn't offer encouragement. He just watched. Corrected her grip, made her start over every time she got it wrong. It was frustrating, not because he was harsh, but because she wanted to impress him and kept falling short. She stayed quiet, grinding through each repetition with clenched teeth. When she finally managed to break the weapon down and reassemble it without dropping a piece, he gave a single nod. That was all she needed. Over the next week it became routine. Disassemble, reassemble, eyes open, then eyes closed. Ford would quiz her on every part. Ask what she was touching, how it worked, why it mattered. When she got something wrong, he made her start again. By the end of the second week, her hands moved faster than her thoughts. She could feel when a pin was a millimeter off. She could tell by weight alone if a spring was missing. The weapon was no longer a stranger. It was becoming something she understood. Then came stance. Ford set her up in front of a blank wall and had her hold position until her legs ached. He moved her feet an inch at a time, adjusted her hips, made her tighten her core, shift her shoulders, told her if her foundation was weak, the recoil would punish her every time. He made her stand like that for what felt like hours, sometimes with the weapon, sometimes without, sometimes blindfolded. It wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting. But slowly, her body began to remember what her mind hadn't yet learned. When they moved to live fire, her nerves returned like a storm. The Desert Eagle kicked like a beast, and her first shot went wide. Her palms stung, her wrist ached, and for a second she thought she'd dropped the weapon. Ford said nothing, just handed her another magazine. Shot after shot, day after day, her grouping tightened. She still flinched, still missed, but she also started to hit. Not every time, but enough to feel like she was making progress. Ford never praised her, not in the way most people did, but he started to let her load the weapon unsupervised, let her call her own pace, trusted her to stop when her form started slipping. That to Emily meant more than words. Some mornings she came in tired, sore from the day before. Sometimes she broke down the gun wrong 3 times in a row and wanted to scream, but she didn't. She just started over, every time, and every time she got a little better. One morning, as she cleared her final shot of the day, she realized she hadn't flinched. The recoil hit her arms, but her stance held. Her aim was off by a hair, but she hadn't lost control. Ford raised an eyebrow like he saw it too, but didn't say a thing. That night back in her room, Emily looked at her reflection. She was tired, covered in sweat. A faint bruise on her shoulder from a recoil mistake earlier in the week, but her eyes were steady. Her hands didn't shake. She wasn't there yet, not even close, but for the first time she believed she might actually get there. Not by talent, not by luck, but by showing up every day and refusing to quit. The announcement came through on a Monday morning, slipped into the weekly bulletin without much fanfare. Fort Danton would be hosting a marksmanship demonstration and competition in 2 weeks, open to all units. Names were listed by category, and near the bottom of the sheet was a simple line that sparked a wildfire: Sergeant Emily Walker, Special Exhibition. By lunch, the rumors had spread like smoke on a dry field. Nobody knew what the exhibition meant, but that didn't stop the theories. Some said she was doing remedial shooting as a lesson in humility. Others guessed she was being set up for one last attempt before getting reassigned behind a desk. It didn't take long before the mocking started again. James led the charge, laughing loud in the mess hall, asking if Emily was going to demonstrate how to miss from 10 feet away. He said she'd probably show up blindfolded just to have an excuse. The table howled. No one noticed Emily sitting alone in the corner, calmly stirring her coffee. She didn't react, didn't flinch. She kept her eyes down and her routine steady. Early mornings with Ford, long hours with the Desert Eagle, silent afternoons in the library reviewing notes, sketching out angles and positioning, repeating every sequence in her head until her hands knew it better than her voice could explain. The talk didn't stop. If anything, it grew. A betting pool started in one of the barracks. Most of the wagers were on how quickly she'd choke. A few bet she wouldn't even show. Only one or two quiet voices wondered if maybe she had something planned they didn't understand. Tension crept in with the rising buzz. Every day felt like it carried a new kind of weight. Emily could feel the eyes on her even if they weren't direct. Whispers in the hallway, quick glances in the gym, casual jokes that didn't feel so casual anymore. Still, she said nothing. She trained like the event wasn't real, like the world outside her morning sessions didn't exist. Ford didn't ask her how she felt. He just showed up same as always, adjusting her grip, watching her form, nodding when her shots landed. The days moved fast and slow all at once. The closer the date came, the heavier the silence grew around her. But inside, something was settling. The fear wasn't gone, but it didn't own her anymore. It sat beside her quiet now and listened to the voice that said she was ready. She didn't owe anyone a performance. She owed herself the proof that she could do it. The crowd would come. The eyes would watch. And when the time came, she wouldn't need to explain a thing. She'd let the shot speak for her. The morning air was heavy with anticipation as the crowd gathered around the range. Folding chairs stretched in rows, officers mingled with enlisted soldiers, and a low hum of conversation rolled across the field. Emily stood behind the line hands, steady eyes forward, blocking out the noise and letting her breath settle. Her name was called, and she stepped up with the Desert Eagle cradled in both hands. The weapon felt familiar now. Not friendly, but known. She loaded the magazine, checked the chamber, and waited for the signal. At the sound of the command, she lifted the gun, aimed, and fired. The first shot cracked across the range, loud and sharp. The second came smoother, her stance absorbing the recoil like she had trained. 5 shots. Tight grouping. Center mass. The screen by the target flickered with the pattern, and a few murmurs rippled through the crowd. She heard it, but didn't let it reach her. That wasn't the real reason they were here. She set the pistol down, then reached into her jacket and pulled out a black cloth. The crowd fell silent as she tied the blindfold over her eyes. Somewhere in the back, someone let out a low whistle. A voice whispered her name, uncertain now. She picked up the weapon again, held it low, centered her weight, and inhaled slow and full. The wind touched her cheek, soft but steady, giving her bearings. Her grip adjusted, her arms lifted, and then she fired. The sound rang out and hung in the air. No one moved. She adjusted again, reset her stance, and fired the second round. A third, a fourth, a final shot. She lowered the weapon, placed it on the table, and untied the blindfold. For a second, she didn't look at the target. She just stood there, letting the moment settle in her chest. Then the range officer hit the retrieval button. The target slid toward them, slow and deliberate. When it reached the firing line, the gasps came all at once. 4 shots had landed in a tight circle just left of center. The 5th clipped high but still inside the silhouette. Applause broke like thunder. Not forced, not polite. Real and loud and rolling through the crowd like it had been held in for weeks. Emily didn't smile. She just nodded once and stepped back. She caught a glimpse of James standing near the edge. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't clapping. He just stared, face unreadable, before turning and walking away without a word. She didn't follow his gaze. She didn't need to. There was no rush of pride, no moment of gloating. What filled her chest wasn't victory. It was release. Not from the challenge, but from the weight she'd carried long before she ever stepped onto that line. In the days after the demonstration, something shifted around the base. People who once passed her without a glance now stopped to nod or say her name with a kind of quiet respect. She wasn't suddenly popular, but the silence that used to trail her had turned into something softer. The video of her blindfolded shooting made its way through command channels and landed on more than a few desks. She was called in by a major who asked if she'd consider helping shape a new marksmanship confidence program. He said her story had stirred something beyond just performance numbers. Emily agreed, not out of pride, but because she understood what it felt like to be on the edge of giving up. If her work could help even one soldier avoid that cliff, it would be worth it. She kept training early with Ford, but now she also met with officers, drafted outlines, and sketched lesson plans in the evenings. One afternoon, just after a session wrapped, she found James standing outside the armory. He didn't look smug or angry. If anything, he looked smaller, like someone carrying more than he used to. He asked if she had a minute, and she nodded. He started slow stumbling through words, saying he was wrong. He mentioned the way he talked about her, the rumors, the laughter, said he thought tearing someone down would make him look stronger, but it just exposed how insecure he really was. She listened, not with bitterness, but with a calm she hadn't had months ago. When he finished, she said she appreciated the apology, that it didn't erase the past, but it helped to hear, that she hoped he found a better version of himself in his next unit. He looked at her for a second like he wanted to say more, but he just nodded and walked away. No dramatic goodbye. No need for one. The air felt clean after he left, like a door had been opened and then closed for good. Emily didn't forgive him to make him feel better. She did it so she could keep moving without carrying the weight of him anymore. That night when she passed by the range, she looked down the empty lanes and let the silence sit for a while. It didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt earned. The recruit was quiet, barely spoke above a whisper, and kept her eyes on the ground more than she did the target. Emily noticed her on the first day of training, flinching with every shot, gripping the rifle like it might turn on her. It was all too familiar. Instead of calling her out, Emily walked over, adjusted her stance, and said nothing at first. Just stood beside her, steady and calm like Ford once did for her. The girl relaxed a little, and by the end of the day she hit the target once and smiled like it meant the world. Emily didn't see herself as a savior, just a mirror. A reminder that doubt could be temporary and growth was slow but possible. Each day she helped the recruit a little more, not just with form, but with focus, with learning to believe that failing wasn't the end. The more time passed, the more she found herself guiding others in the same quiet way. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of her own experience spoke louder than any order could. Months later, at her new post, Emily stood in front of a room full of instructors. They were seasoned, most older than her, and some still unsure what exactly she had to teach. She began not with tactics, but with a story. She spoke about fear, about silence, about how easy it was to label someone weak before giving them a real chance. She told them about a girl who was nearly pushed out not because she couldn't learn, but because no one believed she would. They listened, the room still and respectful. She talked about Ford, about the way one person quietly invested could change everything, and she shared what she learned about training, not just the mechanics, but the mindset behind it. As she wrapped up, she clicked to her final slide. The photo on the screen was simple, a worn blindfold resting on a table beside a desert eagle. There was no caption, no need for one. She looked around the room and told them that sometimes the best way to build a soldier was to first remind them they're more than a scorecard, that the ones who struggle often carry more strength than anyone realizes. They just need time and someone to believe. The instructors clapped, not loud but long, not out of politeness, but because they felt the truth in it. Emily stepped off the stage and didn't feel nervous or small. She felt grounded. Outside, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the field. She passed a group of trainees heading to the range, laughing and nudging each other, full of nerves and hope. One of them looked her way, wide-eyed, and straightened their posture without saying a word. Emily smiled, gave a small nod, and kept walking. She wasn't chasing approval anymore. She had already arrived, and now her job was to leave the door open for someone else.